Hey guys, welcome back to Bible class. I hope you had a good extended weekend. And when you guys are listening to this, I will be married, which is pretty cool. I'm really excited about that. Currently, it's still a ways away when I'm recording this right now. But excited to get there and excited to delve in what we're going to be learning about this week, which is going to be biblical narrative. So, last week, I hope you guys remember, we started talking about the literary styles of the Bible, how those literary styles are like genres, how it's important to know the genre of the Bible so that you know what to expect when you go in. And today, we're going to learn a little bit more about what defines the biblical narrative or biblical story. The first thing we're going to go over, the first video in the series, is plot. Now, I don't know if you guys know what plot is when it comes to narrative, but that's why we're watching this video. To learn a little bit more about it, I'll describe a little bit more as we go in. But before we get into that, I just want to remind you guys of why we're getting into this. I know in introductory stuff, it's pretty easy to forget why you're going over some of this stuff or why it matters. And the point is, I just want to remind you, is that we're going to be going through, or he's trying to go through the whole story of the Bible this year. And I really want to make sure we have a lot of the basics nailed down before we jump into the actual Bible, because a lot of the Bible is going to be narrative, as was said in last week's video. And I want to make sure we know as much about biblical narrative as we can before we go into it, because like I said, if you have the wrong sort of expectations for what would be in something that you're reading or writing or watching, you're going to have some sort of confusion or disappointment potentially when you get out of it. So that's why we're going into this, and so we can understand the Bible better, especially the first book we're going to be reading, which is Genesis, which has a lot of narrative in it. And with that, let's start the video. If you guys haven't, you can take this time to pause the video so that you can open your Google Forms and get out those things so you can answer the questions as I stop the video and start answering questions. All right. Let's get on with it. Hey guys, just want to outline one more quick thing before we go into the video, and that's about the worksheets. So just so you guys know, I'm not expecting you to guys have like long paragraphs or long sentences explaining or answering the questions. Just a couple words or just like one sentence usually will just be enough to answer the worksheet. I'm not expecting looking for a lot. I just want to make sure you guys have gotten the answers and remember what is important. So just letting you know, you don't have to write, 10 sentences about anything or anything like that. Just a couple words or just one sentence should be good enough.
We're learning how to read different types of literature in the Bible. And we're going to start by talking about biblical narrative.
So narratives, in their most basic form, have characters in a setting going through a series of events. And how those events are selected and then arranged by an author, that's called the plot.
A basic plot line begins with a character in her setting. But then something new or unexpected happens, causing problems that lead up to some ultimate conflict, which is then resolved and the character finds herself changed, living in a new normal.
Now, in reading narratives, it's important to understand every scene in the context of its larger plot line.
Okay, just going to jump in here real quick to answer that first question, which is what is plot? Now, that's sort of a big question, but I think I can try to simplify it down for you guys just so we can understand a little bit more about plot, and especially in relation to biblical narrative. This isn't an English class, but we need to know enough about how stories work to be able to understand biblical story. So plot is basically, as they said, the way that the story goes. Basically, as simple as that is the sequence of events in a story, how it lines up beginning to end. Now, in a story, you usually notice, if you look at most any story, any good story that is, it'll start off with a character, usually your person who's the hero or the main character in a story in a normal, ordinary life setting. Then there is a problem, some sort of conflict or problem that's introduced, and then that character is called to go and try to solve that problem or fix that problem somehow. Then they have what's called a climax. It's a term we use in English and in biblical, not even in biblical, just in narrative settings. And that is when the character reaches some sort of, they have a big battle, they have this big conflict moment with someone or whatever the problem is, and they solve that problem, and then it leads to the resolution where there's a new ordinary life at the end of it. That is the plot of most stories. If you read anything, like The Hunger Games, or just most movies that you see, Kung Fu Panda, like any good movie will have that sort of basic trajectory. The same is true for most biblical narratives as well. And so we're just going to work back in the video after that to learn more about plot and biblical narrative.
You can make the same story have a totally different message if you ignore where it occurs in the plot. This happens all the time when people read the Bible.
Really?
Yeah, take for example the story about Gideon. There's this well-known scene where Gideon's trying to discern whether God will help him win a battle, and he requests a sign from God.
Yeah, Gideon lays a wool fleece on the ground and asks that in the morning the fleece be wet with dew, but the ground totally dry, and God does it.
Now, if you look at this scene just by itself, what is the conflict?
How can Gideon know if he'll succeed?
And the resolution?
Test God, ask for a sign, and find out.
Yeah, and that's how many people actually read this story, and it totally misses the point, because it's ignoring the larger plot line.
Really?
Yeah, so let's start from the beginning, you'll get the context. The story begins with Gideon and the Israelites living in fear because they're oppressed by an invading people, the Midianites.
Got it.
Then there's the call to action. God commissions Gideon to defeat the Midianites and save Israel.
Yeah, this is shaping up to be a good story.
But then Gideon's super hesitant, so he asks God to do this magic trick, a sign, so I can know it's really you talking to me. And God stoops to his level. He gives him a sign by lighting this fire on an altar.
So Gideon's already asked for a sign.
And that's not all. In the next scene, God tells Gideon to tear down an altar to another god, but Gideon's so afraid, he does it at night.
So Gideon's skeptical and also a bit of a coward.
Then we come to the moment where Gideon's about to face the Midianites, and he's still uncertain, so he asks for another sign, the fleece. He says, I want to know if you'll save Israel by my hand.
And God gives him that sign.
And he's still uncertain, so he asks for even one more sign, which is just a variation of the previous sign.
Okay, so Gideon's asking for way too many signs.
Exactly. In the larger context, it's clear the plot conflict is not how can Gideon discern the mysterious will of God. The real conflict is, when will this guy get his act together and start trusting God?
Okay, so then what's the resolution?
We have to keep reading. So Gideon gathers this huge army, 30,000 soldiers to fight the Midianites, and God says, no, way too many men. He whittles the army down to 300.
Why would he do that?
Well, Gideon's been testing God, so now God returns the favor. He tells Gideon to arm these 300 soldiers with trumpets and torches, and then surround the Midianites at night and make all this noise in the hills, which sounds ridiculous, but Gideon does it. And the noise scares the Midianites into this frenzy. They start destroying each other in the dark while Gideon looks on safely from the hills.
So this story isn't offering the reader tips for discerning God's will.
No, it's about God's commitment to use weak people with deep flaws to do more than they could have imagined.
Okay, so that was a really interesting story. And honestly, the Gideon story is one of the most misunderstood stories in the Bible for that exact reason. People often take that little snippet about Gideon and the fleece out of context and exchange that to mean that you should just ask God for a little magic trick or a sign to prove that he's really in your life. And that is the answer to question number 2. What do people often mistake the Gideon story to mean? They mistake it to mean you should ask God for signs in your life. Yeah, to ask God for signs. That's a question in your life. But what the Gideon story actually teaches us is that God is always going to be there for the people who even fail him. God is more powerful, and that God can save and protect the people who are weak and flawed. And guess what? That's everybody. Everybody is flawed, and everybody is going to let someone down, and especially God. But God still uses people who are broken and flawed to achieve his purposes. So that's the answer to number 3, is that the Gideon story actually teaches us that God will use people who, aren't the best people in the world to achieve what he needs to get done. And that's one of the most beautiful things about the Bible. Now we're going to see why this is an example of one of the most important things that we can do in biblical narrative, which is make sure we don't take scenes out of context. And that's what we're going to go into next in the video.
Okay, so short scenes, like Gideon and the fleece, are combined with other scenes making up a larger plot line. And tracing the conflict and resolution through the plot helps you see the message the author's trying to get across.
Now, Gideon's story has been set alongside many other stories that are also about these flawed, often questionable leaders called judges. And each of these has its own internal plot line. But then altogether they make up a whole movement of the biblical story, the period of the judges, and that has its own unified plot line.
And there are many movements within the story of the Bible.
Exactly. And all the smaller stories, hundreds of them, they fit within the context of their own movements. And then these movements together make up the building blocks of the grand plot line of the whole story of the Bible.
So no matter where I'm reading in the Bible, I need to pay attention to these different layers of plot so I can read each story in context.
Exactly. The Bible is such a sophisticated piece of literature. And so all these smaller plot lines keep overlapping, building up the tension. And when you back up, you can see how they've all been woven together into the unified story that leads to Jesus.
Okay, so that was a lot. But I think we need to talk about the last two questions in the worksheet. I thought it'd be best just to do it at the end of the video because there was just some good stuff I didn't want to pause. So it's important to read the entire narrative and not just one section. This is sort of answered back during the Gideon part. But the reason that's important is because if you just read one scene, you can misunderstand the message of the whole story. So that's the answer to that one is you will misunderstand the message if you just read one section. And that is one of the most important rules about reading biblical narrative. And if you guys have a notebook, this might be a good time to write that kind of stuff down. You can put a big heading, rules for biblical narrative. Number one, read the whole story. So you should read the whole Bible, but when you're reading like a story, there's usually, as we say, a beginning and end to the very snippet. For the example, the Gideon story, right? We have the introduction to Gideon, we have an introduction to Gideon's character and his setting, and then we have an introduction to the conflict, the climax, where Gideon and the Midianites fight, and the resolution, where Gideon goes back into his normal life. And so it's important to read the whole story and not just the one section, because as we saw, it can make you misunderstand what's really going on in the text. And that sort of leads into the next question as well, is why is it so important to read the whole Bible? A lot of people will just read the sections about Jesus or just teach the sections about Jesus because they think that's what's important. And that is what's important. But if you just read the sections about Jesus, just the climax, you're going to miss out on a lot of the stuff leading up to it. You're not going to get the full story. You could potentially misunderstand what Jesus' whole message was about. And that's really important, is to know what Jesus' whole message is about. So that's why we're learning about this. That's why we're starting from the beginning of the Bible. We're going to go all the way through it and try to understand it as this whole unified story leading to Jesus. So for that last question, you can put, it's important to read the whole Bible. The same reason as above, really, is because if we don't read the whole Bible, we'll misunderstand some of the messages, especially coming from Jesus. Okay, and as we wrap up this video, I just want to thank you all for sticking in there. Thank you for doing this over Zoom. I know it's a little different, and it's probably a lot easier if I could just talk and answer your questions in person. But thanks for sticking with us. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate you guys are, answering the questions and zooming in and making sure you're getting some good education about this. It makes me really happy so that you guys are answering questions and learning about the Bible. And with that, we'll just end in prayer, and then I'll hand you back over to Mac. God, thank you for this day, and thank you that these kids are learning about you. Thank you that we get to have such great resources like the Bible Project to make us understand biblical narrative more, the very important subject that is biblical narrative. I pray that you teach and illuminate these kids. You can do it a lot better than I could. And pray they learn more and more about you, about the way that you've chosen to present and to show yourself to us through the Bible. I pray that they learn to love it and to love you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Well, you guys will see me tomorrow. Bye.